Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 wild format cards that should be added to the standard format core set. Now, the way it works right now, as soon as an adventure or an expansion falls out of the standard format calendar, those cards are basically lost to wild format forever, and you never see them again in the primary format of Hearthstone. But what if Blizzard decided that there were some cards that were just so good or so fundamental or important to the game that they actually added them into a core set? So instead of just the classic and basic cards making up the foundation of standard format, what if Blizzard actually just created a core set, they called it, where they picked the best cards from each adventure and expansion as it phased out, along with the classic and basic set. So basically you might have, 5 or 10 cards from each adventure or expansion that were good for the game, that players enjoyed, and that set up certain archetypes or deck types that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And I've identified 10 of those cards that you'd currently see in wild format. So let's jump right into my list, starting off with number 10. It is the Explosive Sheep. I really missed this card because it gave us a neutral area of effect clear. So instead of relying on a class spell, which can sometimes be finicky depending upon which cards are in standard format at the time, this would essentially give every class its own way to deal with a small board of minions. And the great thing about Explosive Sheep, there's no random effects. It's a very balanced card. It doesn't feel overpowered for what it does. It's on moderate amount of play, but wasn't ever oppressive in the meta. So it feels like a good fit to stick around forever. At my number 9 spot, I'd like to see Spider Tank come back. This one may not look all that exciting, but there's just something about a vanilla 3-mana 3/4 that I think's really good for the game. That's an important stat allocation that isn't necessarily available to every class. Plus, this is a cheap and affordable card to craft, so that would open that slot up for budget players. Another benefit of this card, and a couple others on this list, is that it reopens the mech tribal synergy options. As soon as Goblins versus Gnomes faded out, mechs basically went away, and have been a few added, but there aren't enough mech synergy cards for them to really matter that much as a tribe. So adding a few of those back in could really bring that tribe back to life. And Spider Tank is one of the safest, most reliable, and helpful ways to do so without breaking the meta with cards like Piloted Shredder. Spoiler alert, Piloted Shredder will not be on this list. At my number 8 spot, I've got Tinker's Sharp Sword Oil. This is a 4-mana rogue spell that does something that rogue doesn't really always have access to right now, which is making a weapon a threat and a dangerous utility tool. Currently, there's really just deadly poison and the occasional actual weapon itself that makes rogue scarier, but this was one of the most reliable ways to make your hero power valuable as rogue and set up a lot of different combos and options. Even though Blade Flurry has been nerfed, I still think Tinker Sharp Sword Oil could be a good card, particularly because that combo also opens up a lot of burst damage potential, and that's something that Rogue doesn't have a ton of right now and could use consistently and predictably to make opponents scared and give them a more reliable threat. Although a lot of cards on this list are going to be about countering aggressive metas, that is not what my number 7 pick is about. This is Jeeves, and he's very good at encouraging hyper-aggressive face-style decks, because even when you unload your hand in a blitz of damage and aggression, Jeeves is there to refill it. And the great thing about Jeeves is he gives that option to every class, so instead of relying on a specific class's mechanism to reload your hand, like Divine Favor, for instance, which not every class has in the standard basic set, Jeeves opens up that option, giving everybody a more consistent and predictable way to make sure that they can draw a bunch of cards if they do decide to play a face deck. Now, that may not be something you're excited about or want to see, but I do think it's important just to maintain the balance and the full range of deck archetypes available to every class. So Jeeves is a mech, he opens up that option, and he really never felt particularly overpowered or unbalanced. So I don't think he'd destroy the game, but he would certainly encourage a wider diversity of decks for each and every class in the game. For my number 6 card, I have chosen the Paladin Secret Avenge. Although a lot of people considered this one slightly oppressive in the Secret Paladin meta of old, I actually think it's a really important card for Paladin to have, because right now Paladin simply doesn't have a ton of good or scary secrets, and secrets just don't feel like a viable part of the class these days. So having one that's very good and very strong could be healthy for the class and make people have to consider secrets as an option. And whenever they see a secret, they'd have to be a little bit more scared of it and play around it. So Avenge just opens up that important part of Paladin that is otherwise completely underutilized at this point, and seems like that could be a risk moving forward, that adding Avenge back into the standard core set would really help mitigate. At the number 5 spot, it is the Pre-Spell Light Bomb. This is really one of the best, most efficient board clears that the game has ever seen, which was really important to Priest, because Priest needs ways to stabilize and recover the board to be successful. And even though One Night in Karazhan has seemingly made Priest a little bit better these days, there is still that risk that the Priest standard basic set isn't really all that good and doesn't have access to reliable enough board clears, and Light Bomb would fix that. And there's no way that this card could be considered oppressive or overpowered, because the effect is completely balanced. It damages your own minions just as much as it might your opponents, so it's a neutral effect. So it feels like a nice balanced card that's important for the class, that does something cool and unique, and I'd like to see it in a core set to make Priest more consistently viable. Moving on to my number 4 spot, it is one of those anti-aggro cards I was talking about. It is the Antique Healbot, and unlike the Sludge Belcher, which also could have been added to this list, but spoiler alert, was not, I think the Antique Healbot is a much safer card to include. Sludge Belcher is very annoying and oppressive in some ways, just because it's a bundle of stats and so frustrating to play around. Antique Healbot doesn't have quite that frustration element, but still does help counter aggressive metas. And this is one of the best healing cards we've seen, and the important thing about Antique Healbot is that it was a neutral heal, whereas most of the good heals in the game have been class-based heals that are added in adventures and expansions, which makes them very unreliable and unpredictable as far as future metas are concerned. So having that one consistent way to know that you've got a heal if you need it makes Antique Healbot an important card, and this is another one that, because its stats are so meager, it never really felt like it was dominating the meta or being overpowered in any way. So I wouldn't mind seeing this card back in a core set. Could be a very good thing for Hearthstone's balance. Moving on to the top 3, with number 3, it is Deathlord, the big old early game taunt from Naxxramas. Unlike something like Sludge Belcher, which I already discussed, Deathlord felt like a more balanced version of a good anti-aggro taunt, in that it has a big risk-reward assessment that you have to make anytime you run this card in your deck, because of course that Death Rattle can punish you pretty significantly, particularly in control-style matchups. So although it gives you a nice advantage against aggro, it can be very harmful against control in many ways if they get those free Tyrians or free Ragnaroses or whatever else it might be on turn 3. So a balanced card that counterplays a certain aspect of the meta but also puts you at risk feels like a healthy way to put an early game taunt that's very powerful and gives people options as far as they're concerned when building their deck and trying to counter specific archetypes, and that's a card I'd like to see come back. At my number 2 spot is the only legendary card on this list, and that's because often legendaries can feel overpowered or crazy, but this card, Loatheb, I think might just be the most balanced and fair and awesome legendary that Hearthstone has ever designed or released. Loatheb is a 5-mana 5/5, the epitome of balance already. But this battlecry was so cool. Enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. This is the kind of card that just felt right. When you played it, you knew you were doing something significant and disrupting your opponent's turn. As someone who might have wanted to play around Loatheb, it was always a consideration you have to make. Like, I can win the game next turn, what if they Loatheb? Or you could build a big board and Loatheb yourself to win the game this turn to secure your board against things like removal. So there was so much thought and consideration put into this card in every turn. So it had a lot of counterplay and strategy elements behind it. Unlike a dumb card like Yogg-Saron, you kind of just throw down when I say dumb, I don't mean I hate Yogg-Saron. He's fun, he's awesome, but he's dumb, right? Like, you don't necessarily have to think so much about when to use Yogg-Saron. Loatheb in many ways had the same kind of effect. Sometimes he could just win you the game, but you had to be very careful and considerate about when you played him, and I think adding that skill element back with a good mid-range balanced legendary that fits into virtually almost any kind of deck would be a really nice thing for Hearthstone. This is one of the best legendaries that Blizzard has ever put out in the game, and one of the most fun and one of the smartest, and I'd love to see it come back someday. But even though Loatheb couldn't take the top spot on my list, that honor belongs to the meager 1 mana Zombie Chow. This little guy may not seem like much. He might look like he has a terrible death rattle if you're new to the game and don't quite understand how health as a resource works. But Zombie Chow is such an important card and was so good for the game that I desperately miss him. The fact that he is a 1 mana 2/3 gives him so much control over the early game. He trades into 2/1s on turn 1. He can also trade up a little bit on turn 2 sometimes against certain minions. So he gave late game control decks a way to answer really aggressive early game starts without any downside, basically, because, you know, in the first few turns you're very unlikely to damage your opponent as a slower deck anyway, so this death rattle had very little risk, but still gave you a lot of answers and a lot of control against your opponent. This feels like a very balanced early game card that kept aggression in check. And Hearthstone's meta is very, very fast these days, and there's just not enough cards that can reliably counter that. Zombie Chow, you're dearly and desperately missed. Please come back and save us from all of the aggro decks. And that'll do it for my list. Those are my top 10 cards from Wild format that should be added back into Standard as a part of a core set of some sort. I'm sure you think I got the list all wrong. I'm sure you think I missed awesome cards. But remember, I wasn't trying to pick the best cards or the most overpowered cards, but just the cards that would be best for the game if they stuck around forever. So that said, if you have your own thoughts or your own list, I'd love to see you share it in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.